各位生技聊一聊的观众，大家好，我是资诚创新医材产业主持会计师林冠宏。随着科技的飞速发展，数位疗法已经成为改善患者健康的重要工具。数位疗法不仅改善了患者的医疗体验，还让健康管理更加的精准以及个人化。然而，随着数位疗法兴起，如何有效地来评估这些技术的安全性与有效性，以及如何制定合适的给付标准，是数位疗法在成长路上的一大挑战。本集生技聊一聊，很高兴能够邀请到英国格拉斯哥大学 Olivia 吴教授、David Lowe 教授以及 Neil Hawkins 教授，为我们带来主题演讲 Preparing for the Digital Health Revolution: Insights from the UK on Health Technology Assessment.and responsible AI innovation in digital healthcare. Olivia 吴教授曾经担任英国国家健康暨照护卓越研究院技术评估委员会的成员，长达10年的时间，深入了解 HTA 所需的证据及其在决策中的应用。David Lowe 教授为英国健康验证实验室临床创新实验室主任，曾领导多个数位健康领域解决方案的开发。而 Neil Hawkins 教授是英国 NICE 诊断咨询委员会的副主席，对于 NICE 的运作有深厚的经验，相信他们的演讲将为观众带来深刻的启发。那么接下来我们就将时间交给他们。
We've been doing HTA for a long time, and some of you we've met many times over the years talking about HTA in drugs, but in digital health, it is a new area, even for the UK. So we are still, I think, at the beginning of our journey. And so what we will do is we will share with you what we've learned so far. I'm just going to tell you the ending of the story. We don't have solutions. We don't have the clear solutions, but we can tell you what we've tried, what's been really difficult, and what we want to do going forward. I think UK, like the rest of the world, are very excited about the potential opportunities of using digital health technologies. And for us, the big drive came from our new government about a year ago. So the government, when they came into place, they declared missions that they want to achieve. So 5 key missions, and you can see on the bottom left there. There's a big focus on economic growth. There's a big focus on our healthcare service, so build an NHS that's fit for the future. There's focus on security, safer streets, breaking down barriers to opportunities, and making Britain a clean energy superpower. So these are the 5 missions for the government, and health is very much up there. And what do they mean by building an NHS that's fit for the future? So what they wanted to focus on is make sure that the health service is accessible to everybody. They want to make sure that people in the UK live better and live longer. And they also wanted to be a fairer UK where everybody will live well. So the 3 things that they think we could actually action on. One is shifting care from hospital to home. So trying to reduce the number of patients coming into secondary care and being managed in the home setting. And alongside that, the big focus is also on going from analog to digital. So there's a big belief that the use of digital health technology is really going to help us achieve these goals. And finally, the last thing that the government's really focusing on is prevention. So if we focus on prevention, we can reduce the burden on treatment. Digital health technology is like any health technology. So for our health system to adopt any health technologies, we have to establish value. So we've done that for a long time with drug treatment. Now with digital health interventions, we also require the same questions to be answered. So NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, have a long history of doing that for drugs. And now NICE has to expand and think about digital health technologies. So fundamentally, the question we're asking is the value. Is it worth our health service investing in these new digital health technologies? And what gains are we going to get from it? Is it going to be a positive gain? And what is the size of the benefits we're going to get from it? So this is a very similar question to drugs. but the process of getting there is a lot more challenging. NICE has an evidence standard framework for evaluating digital health technologies. So the way that we're looking at health technologies at the moment is split according to the potential impact of the health technologies. So it's graded tier A, B, and C. And at the bottom, tier A are technologies that are expected to have no or very little influence on individual patient outcomes. It's really about the system, more efficiency of the system. Whereas at the top of tier C are digital healthcare interventions that we expect will have an influence on patient outcomes. So if it is a health technology that is under the tier C category, then more high quality evidence is demanded to demonstrate that value proposition. So within this framework, these are the things that the framework covers. They ask developers to think about. So the framework covers the design factor, how the design of the digital health technology. And then the second big block is about value. So value proposition is really important. So developers have to be very clear about what is the intended purpose of the intervention and what is the target population. You have to really think about what we're currently doing and what your new technology is going to do, how it's going to do things differently, and where is it going to enter the whole pathway. So that is really, really important. And so compared to drug treatments, I think digital health technologies is a lot more complex if you think about the pathway that it can be implemented. And you also need to think about the expected cost, the resource impact compared to the current care. So what is the added value? This is one of the big areas that we need to think about. It also asks about performance and also delivering value and deployment considerations. So demonstrating performance is where the bulk of the evidence generation lie. So in tier C, digital health technologies, the category that we expect to have impact on patient outcomes, we expect evidence of effectiveness. Now, traditionally with drug treatments, we expect to see randomized control trials, but for digital health technologies, it is not always straightforward. It's not impossible to do trials with digital health technologies, but it's a lot more difficult. We also need to make sure that we need to demonstrate the benefits can be realized in practice. So not just in a trial setting, but also in real practice, so in clinical practice. So there is a clearer drive towards thinking about the capability of real world data. And also the last thing is about thinking about moving forward, the potential changes of performance over time and how we're going to monitor that. And of course, there's also the element about thinking about value for money. So within this framework for digital health technologies, we're also interested in the budget impact and also cost effectiveness. Now, economic evaluations that we often do to determine cost effectiveness are very different for digital health technologies compared to pharmaceuticals. So the comparator, when we think about in pharmaceuticals, is generally quite well defined, but with digital health technologies is a lot more complex. We all talk about the evolving nature of digital health technologies. So even though you're appraising a certain digital health technology at this time point, but in future, it will evolve, it will get updated. So how do we deal with that? In terms of who's involved in using the technologies, digital health technologies often involve multiple disciplines working together compared to pharmaceuticals, which can be more limited. How to cost digital interventions is also very challenging compared to pharmaceuticals. And in terms of assessing benefits in health, in pharmaceuticals, we often think about the benefits expressed as quality adjusted life years for individual patients. So in the UK, we often think about incremental cost per quality, but is this sufficient for digital health technologies? So are we capturing all the benefits? And in terms of how we conduct those economic analysis, it will require a bit more thought as well. So NICE recognized that. And so NICE has a program called Early Value Assessment for Medical Technologies. And what it aims to do is to engage industry and developers at early stages to help them think about the evidence gap, to plan the evidence generation. And my colleague Neil is going to talk a little bit more about that later. So I think it's really good that we recognize that we can't all be doing our work in isolation. We need to work together. There has to be collaboration for this to work. And finally, at a government level, we're also investing in academic research in this area. So within the National Institute for Health and Care Research, our NIHR, there's a program called Invention for Innovation. And this program primarily support new technologies. A lot of it is digital health technologies, and they will fund some of the evidence generation. So it is like applying for any grant funding. Academics can partner with industry or developers to propose a good study that will address a relevant evidence gap, and they will have a chance to get funded by the government. And David sits on one of the funding panels for I4I, and I think Neil is also going to talk a bit more about that. So that's kind of broadly where the focus has been in the HTA space for digital health technologies. I'm going to now pass on to David to talk a bit about the kind of global perspective and the type of digital health technologies that we're looking at.
So my name is David Lowe. I'm a Professor of Health Innovation within the University of Glasgow, but I have also roles in Scottish Government as their Director for Innovation and on occasion still an emergency medicine doctor working in the A&E department. And what I'm going to really do is, I suppose, build a little bit on Olivia's story around about essentially health tech evaluation, and really think about how we can do that and potentially some of the perspective we've got around about evaluating these technologies, often with international partners from medtech companies around the world, and be able to build evidence for ultimately getting onto guideline and be able to deploy those technologies. So I suppose as part of that welcome, that piece is around some of the insights that we're going to share around about how we're developing that evidence and the ability to do that. I'm very thoughtful when I was reading about Taiwan and the healthcare system around about some of the opportunities that Taiwan has currently, that intersection of deep tech capabilities, and we've got some colleagues in the room from some of those industries, as well as thinking about how those technologies can be deployed into the healthcare system, recognising, as Olivia said, that shift towards community care and finally that collaborative opportunity. This is a hospital that I work in. It was built 5 years ago, but yet we are still challenged, as the next picture, my emergency department, with comorbid individuals coming in and waiting often extensive times. We see one excess death for every 75 patients, waiting greater than 10 hours, either in an ambulance or in a trolley within my emergency department. Just quite the motivation. And when we look at technologies, and Olivia's been a co-conspirator in a number of these trials, 80% of people get a heart failure diagnosis in my emergency department rather than in the community. And how do we actually be able to use both technologies, AI in particular, to identify, case find those individuals, put them on guideline-based therapy and prevent them from coming into hospital. And really the purpose of my group and working with Olivia and Neil is around about how do we create evidence to support a paradigm shift in how we deliver health, which often, as Olivia's already alluded to, is an understanding forensically of the current clinical pathway, how both the patient flow, the clinical flow and the data flow allows you to think about how those technologies can be deployed to be able to demonstrate value. And why it matters now is because we're at again, that intersection of exponential technologies that can be deployed to the exponential challenge we face within healthcare delivery. We're seeing increasingly, and you look around this room, and it's no different than many rooms that I stand in, around about wearables and Internet of Things, and particularly about ambient sensors and how they can inform health outcomes both in looking after patients in the community. And then finally that piece around the genomic integration. We are increasingly in the UK pushing towards whole genome sequencing, and certainly targeted sequencing for our pharmacogenomics is a good example, and how that can be integrated into predictions of care. And that allows us to think about how we transform patient journeys, how we respond to the digital health market that currently is there, and actually leverage some of that to create systems and solutions that can benefit our patients. And then, as increasingly we're thinking both within an academic sphere and equally within healthcare delivery, how do we move towards personalised and predictive care that's equitable? Because certainly one of the big challenges we have, especially within Glasgow, is a high deprivation population that often are the drivers for care delivery. And why digital health now? We've already alluded to that exponential technology growth, but we've got an ageing population, we've got significant clinical staff shortages. Much of the research I do currently is within the radiology space, and we're predicting a 30% shortfall in radiologists. And then chronic disease explosion, certainly by 2050, we're looking at an obesity crisis that was published in Lancet recently, of 50% of the population being overweight within the UK, but equally thinking about comorbid disease and how we manage that more effectively, allied with rising patient expectations that have to be responded to. And some of the work that we're doing, that we'll perhaps allude to, is remote cardiac rehabilitation. How do we identify and look after the frail in the community? And then the rural mental health care problems around about how do we deliver equitable healthcare, shifting from reactive care, patients in ambulances outside my emergency department, into a proactive preventative model that leverages the data that exists within the healthcare system and increasingly consumer health as well. And you, as you well know, have some significant advances in that area, both that semiconductor and IT strength, an innovation culture that takes tradition and be able to take biotechnologies and medical devices and a healthcare infrastructure that frankly allows you to be able to think about how we adopt those solutions in a single care system that allows those technologies to be evaluated and deployed, especially AI, which I think we'll talk about a bit later, into a system, be able to evaluate it as it's deployed into a whole system rather into a single institution. And we think about opportunity areas. AI for decision support is a key area that increasingly we're certainly looking at in the UK. A digital first approach to aging, and how do we look after the population first with the digital set of tools, decentralised clinical research and becoming a hub for some of the digital trials that are coming through to again gather evidence for technology companies to deploy these across territories worldwide, and then personalised prevention. And when we think about AI decision support, there's some significant challenges, but equally opportunities around about how you gather clinical data at scale and map that to be able to both train, validate, and ultimately deploy technologies. How you be able to use those machine learning algorithms to detect patterns. That heart failure example that I gave around about heart failure detection in the community before they come into hospital, before they have worsening disease. And then how do you be able to apply those technologies into a healthcare system to make decisions that are actually going to speed people through the hospital or identify them to specialists earlier. And within the digital first aging piece, remote monitoring, how do we be able to use wearables and Internet of Things to be able to monitor those individuals for falls risk and be able to identify them and be able to put interventions in place so they don't fall over, break a hip and come into hospital. Integrate that increasingly into the builds of housing, recognising that the population at the moment will age into that housing that's being built, and those ambient sensors become really important in delivery of care. And then that family connection, which is really critical, is how do we continue to have digital platforms that allow family to be informed and involved in care as people become older, especially when culturally, perhaps certainly in the UK, people don't live necessarily in the same town that they were born in. From a digital trials point of view, critically, we've had some significant investments from pharmaceutical companies in this area. Is how do we move to digital trial forms of both consent, remote monitoring and real world data? And that's allowing us and really starting to create that provocation of how do we move from the existing paradigm of nursing staff going around the hospital trying to identify those individuals with heart failure or COPD, and be able to think about how, if we're going to be able to using digital therapeutics, but also digital companion apps for high cost and potentially high consequence therapeutics such as biologics and COPD and asthma, and be able to use real world data to be able to support the deployment of those technologies. And then finally, around about precision personalised medicine. Genomics increasingly becoming a component of how we're delivering care, but how do we use that data to be able to inform not just the care of that individual when they've got heart failure diagnosis and considering which therapy to put them on, but to be able to inform future choices. So when they have a stroke, you know that you can prescribe the right medication. How do you aggregate that with healthcare data and increasingly lifestyle factors to be able to take Garmin data, Fitbit data, or indeed Apple Watch data through to be able to inform both risk, but also management of those individuals to be able to shift care into the community to deliver personalised care. And I think Olivia's already described this from a HTA point of view, is how do you build interdisciplinary teams to evaluate these technologies? How do you invest in real-world evaluation that demonstrates effectiveness? Because one of the challenges we currently have is that the in-circle validation, especially of AI, speaks to its technical performance, but not necessarily its performance when you deploy it into a healthcare system. And then increasingly, certainly the technologies we are deploying within the radiology sphere that we're currently evaluating, they come from India, they come from Australia, which then means we have to think about our prevalence of disease and how those technologies perform in our population, which is perhaps quite different. And therefore, these bilateral partnerships are really important to be able to understand how technologies can benefit our patients and how we can accelerate their adoption through models of reimbursement, but as Olivia's already alluded to, be able to demonstrate value, elements of guidelines, and support clinicians being able to use those technologies within the healthcare system. So I suppose my final thoughts is where I think we're undoubtedly in a unique position. The point around collaboration is really well made. And then finally, how do we learn from you around about some of the technologies that you're adopting and how we can potentially take them through? And this conversation about evaluation is really critical so that we can actually make good choices for those technologies we're going to adopt. So thank you very much.
My role in this story is I'm a statistician and a health economist, and I sit on two of the NICE committees that look at digital health technologies. I sit on the Medical Technologies Committee and the NICE Diagnostics Committee. And we'll talk a bit about how NICE is handling the assessment of these technologies in the UK and how it fits into that wider policy environment. As Olivia talked a bit about the policy environment, when our new government came in a year or so ago, they commissioned Lord Darcy to do a review of the national healthcare system. And one of his conclusions was there must be a major tilt towards technology to unlock productivity, whereas enormous potential in AI to transform care and for life sciences breakthroughs to create new treatments. So we had a very, very clear policy statement from the Ministry of Health. And our Minister for Health, Wes Streeting, has been very clear. He talks about this a lot. He talks about the companies and the importance of this to the NHS. So at the very top level, we have a very clear message of the importance of these technologies. But we also need to look at the economic context with digital health technologies. And one of the things we see here is we often have multiple rapidly developing competing technologies. In the appraisals I look at for digital health technologies, it's not unusual for us to look at 10 alternative technologies. Whereas when we look at drugs, we often have one or two technologies, drugs which are clearly differentiated. Here we have multiple companies developing comparable technologies, and they're not strongly differentiated, and they don't have the intellectual property protections that new drugs have. Because, to be honest, we see a lot of technologies doing quite similar things. Now, actually, this is great for a health system. It means that we have a competitive market, and these technologies are often really good value. And actually, if they do what they say they're going to do, they're going to be very cost effective. They can't charge the high prices that new drugs can. It's great for the health system. However, there is a downside to this. It means that individual companies that have limited surplus funds available to fund studies. Drug companies can develop $1 billion products. That gives them large cash kind of balances to invest in their new products, invest in their research, invest in their trials, and they basically have potential to gain from that investment in research. With digital healthcare technologies, it's much more difficult. The companies don't have those large surplus profits to draw upon on research, and they may not be able to individually benefit from research because companies can free ride off other companies' investments. So the economic context for digital health is very different. And it's critical that we recognise this when we evaluate these technologies. So, key message, digital health is very different from the pharmaceutical market. We must recognise that when we assess these products. But they do have great potential to really help with some of the pressing problems our health systems face at the moment. So the consequence of this is the successful development and implementation and diffusion of digital health technologies will require collaboration between health systems and policymakers, the health technology developers, and the methodologists, the academics. This has been termed the triple helix. Part of this is the I4I programme, which Olivia mentioned. So this is where the government is investing in the development of evidence, because we recognise that we cannot rely, in fact the industry is probably not able to develop the evidence we require to assess these technologies. So there has to be a partnership, kind of public-private partnership. Then we developed the early value assessment. And I'm really proud to be talking about this. I think it's a really important innovation. And basically what it says is we recognise that when we look at these digital health technologies, they don't have the quality of evidence that we would expect to see for new pharmaceuticals. We don't see those phase 3 comparative clinical trials. It's not possible for the companies to run them, to be frank. They don't have the resources or the money, and they won't get the return on them. So what early value assessment said is that we would look at these technologies and we would assess their potential to develop, to deliver value. Not that we're convinced they do, but the question is, do they have the potential to develop, deliver value? And if they do, we're prepared to give them a conditional recommendation for use while further evidence is generated. And this includes the development of an evidence generation plan. So the committee, as I sit on, we look at these technologies and we say, well, yes, the evidence is limited at the moment, but we believe these technologies have real potential to deliver value. So we'll develop a plan which will describe what we need to learn about, what the uncertainties are that we need to address while these products are used in clinical practice. So it's kind of conditional, yes, but with a very different threshold saying yes than we apply to, say, pharmaceuticals. The topic selection is very important. Basically, this is done, again, in conjunction with the health system. The health and social care systems identify through strategic reviews what are their priorities. And then technologies which can potentially address these priorities, they're put forward into the early value assessment programme. So it's a very systematic view of what we need to look at. So we're investing our evaluation resource very carefully into those technologies that we think are important. To give you some idea of what we've been looking at, we've been looking at quite a lot actually. So we've got technologies to manage symptoms of psychosis or prevent relapse in adults and young people. Digital technologies for delivering multidisciplinary weight management services. Technologies for managing non-specific low back pain. Technologies for therapy for adults with depression, for agoraphobia, subject close to probably David's heart. AI-derived software to analyse chest X-ray for suspected lung cancer. And we can see these are technologies which do address absolutely pressing issues we have. Mental health, we do not have the capacity. There's huge demand for mental health services, and we do not have the capacity to manage those. Weight management, we have a huge obesity problem in the UK. Again, our obesity clinics are completely overloaded. So we have essentially digital technologies which will address that. Non-specific low back pain. Really difficult problem to treat. I'm sure it takes lots of clinical visits. Again, something we need to look at. So we can see how we've chosen these topics to address our current pressing needs. And we're willing to bring these technologies into the health service while we collect evidence to prove ourselves that they work. But it's not just enough to evaluate a product and say yes. You've got to put some money into it. So alongside it, we have a medtech funding mandate. And for certain technologies which have been approved by NICE, the medtech funding mandate basically tells our commissioners, our payers, they have to pay for these technologies when they're clinically appropriate. However, the funding mandate does not provide additional funding, but we're picking technologies which we believe will actually reduce costs and reduce budgets. Alongside that, these are some of the things that have been looked at, have been given that funding mandate. Non-invasive device to reduce pain from osteoarthritis, electrosurgery for transurethral resection, benign water vapor to treat benign prostatic hyperplasia, and so on. And on top of actually telling the commissioners that they have to pay, this is monitored centrally by the National Health System to check that these technologies are being used and are being taken up by our individual health providers. And just to give you some example, during 2021-22, number of patients accessing heart flow increased by 35%, and it was estimated that this created £2.2 million worth of savings to the NHS. And again, secure cap rose by fivefold, again saving about £2.5 million. So what we see is a completely joined up system where we have policy being declared by the government, by the Department of Health. This is then fed through into the assessment programme, which recognises the context for digital health, the challenges and limitations, and we developed a new process to actually encourage use of these technologies whilst gathering evidence. And then finally, there's a funding mandate to make sure that the payers and commissioners actually do use these technologies. So we need this collaboration, and it needs to feed through at all levels, going right from the policy level to the evaluation to funding. I've also worked with companies where health ministers have said we want X. When the companies try and develop X, there is no pathway for them to get their technologies evaluated and used. So I think the really important thing here is this consistency of a pathway for technologies to come through which meet the policy requirements or the pressing health requirements of our health system. Thank you very much.
非常感谢3位学者的精彩分享，对于数位疗法的 HTA 及给付提供了深入的见解。在演讲中，3位学者介绍了英国 NICE 在数位疗法评估和给付过程中的考量，并分享了英国推动数位疗法的临床应用以及健保给付机制、临床证据的生成以及 HTA 评估等实务经验。台湾拥有卓越的数位科技能量与高品质的医疗体系，若能为数位疗法设计专属的给付途径以及审查标准，将有助于帮助更多的产品进入市场，并进一步鼓励产业发展，提升医疗的可进性及全民健康福祉。最后感谢各位观众的收看，希望大家在这次的演讲中都有很丰富的收获。资诚生技医疗服务团队协助业者从设立、营运规划、募资、申请补助、建立制度，到上市上柜、跨境合作、并购与永续发展等各阶段，提供财税、会计、法律及制裁等专业服务，提供客户最佳解决方案。若大家有任何问题，欢迎与我们的专业服务团队联络，也欢迎大家扫描 QR Code。进入资诚生技医疗网页，加入资诚会员，订阅电子报，追踪最新生医全球趋势与资诚动态。谢谢大家的收看。